I'm super excited for today's episode of the Caroline Gleich Show. I have with me two guests today, which is awesome. Carolina Rubio MacWright. Carolina, sorry, MacWright.
Yes, you got it.
Carolina Rubio MacWright. She's an artist, an immigration lawyer, an ultrarunner and coach, and a climate migration activist. And then Vanessa Chavarriaga, who's a Colombian immigrant, environmental sociologist, mountain athlete, one of my dear friends, my mentee, but so much more. We've had so many fun days in the mountains today. And I'm excited to chat with you about mountain sports, running, and also about immigration, because you two both have done so much, have such interesting perspectives on this. And so thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about and to congratulate you on, Carolina, is you recently completed the Western States Endurance Run. It's a 100-mile foot race. And do you want to tell me a little bit more about that? That's a huge accomplishment, like huge congrats.
Thank you so much. I had Vanessa there with me, which is part of why I was able to finish, because it's when you run 100 miles, sure, it's about your mental ability, but it's so much more about the group that you're with and your crew and the people that run with you. And so it's the oldest race in the nation, the oldest ultra. And it starts up in the mountains, up in the snow where you guys love. And then it dips into the desert. So it's a really challenging race, but it was super fun. It was incredible to experience it and to have the opportunity to do such a awesome race.
Was it your first 100?
No, this was my second 100.
Wow.
But it was special. My family never comes to my races because it's such a sacred space for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first time that they, came to one of my big races, and that was really special. So they're pumped about sports and mental agility and all that. So that's exciting.
That is so cool. And Vanessa, I know from when I've crewed before that oftentimes being a crew and a supporting figure in these big endurance feats is as much of an accomplishment as doing the run yourself. So how was it for you as a crew? And did you pace too?
Yes.
I crewed and paced. Yeah. Yeah. It was a wild experience. I think it was my first time doing any of it. But it was pretty hilarious to, I think be driving. Like I drove my van down and we were driving my van like hours and hours on end, and it was like a hurry up and wait game where we would arrive at a location and we were super stressed that we were going to miss her, but then she hadn't come yet, and so we just had to sit there and wait, cheer her on, and we got like maybe 2 or 3 minutes with Carolina, and then we wouldn't see her again for a few hours. My favorite was the river crossing Rocky Chucky at about 2:30 in the morning, and I was just eating like nerds clusters because I was trying to stay awake, and we brought a speaker and some lights and just brought the vibes, and we were blasting Karol G, and we find Carolina at like 2:30 a.m. and she's not only what mile were you at that point?
It was 78.
Yeah, she had run 78 miles. It was 2 a.m. and she starts dancing merengue with me, and it was just like one of the most beautiful moments that we've ever shared. And then like go back to the van, drive to the next destination, and then I was pacing her during the last 6 miles. So we watched the sunrise, and then I was like, oh no, I have to run now. And like, I had to show up, like we have to finish. But it was a beautiful finish, and Carolina absolutely crushed it. And I think her strength definitely kept all of us going as we were crewing and pacing.
That's amazing. Those moments on the trail when you're like so delirious too, I feel like are some of the most painful, but the most fun. And I'm really psyched that it went well and you were able to finish. And so how do you two know each other?
You want to take this one?
Sure, I'll take this one. We met at a Footprints camp. It's like a climate and running camp. It was a little bit of a disaster situation with the management of the camp, but we met there and we've been super close and friends ever since because we're both from Colombia, and there's just so much similarity and synergy with the way that we view the world and how passionate we are about immigration and immigrants and our story. So I feel like we just clicked immediately because of that value system, right? You can identify it and it's been amazing.
It is. It's so fun when you meet your people, like when you have that connection, it's like when I've met people like that, it kind of transcends time, really. Like you feel like you might have only known each other for a minute, but there are people you meet in life where you feel like you've known each other since you were born, or like since before you were born. Like your spirits are connected. And so it's so amazing when you can meet people like that. And then when you can do things together like you all just did, that's so cool. So do you want to tell me, Carolina, a little bit more about what you do as an immigration lawyer?
Yeah, absolutely. First, like, I'm an immigrant, came to the US when I was 19. And so I think that piece really sort of dictates so much of my journey and my experience as an immigrant, as a student, as a law student. And so it's my experience, my first summer of law school in the border really made me decide to do a lot of what I do now, which is making sure people understand their rights, that people have a chance. Having read policies and worked in the Hill for a little bit, that really showed me that when the policies were drafted, Caroline, in the 60s, there were only 15 women in all of Congress, and there were no immigrants in that room. Laws have not changed since the 60s.
Wow.
So when you look at the policy, you realize that it really shows who was in the room. We've got 12 million undocumented immigrants that are hoping to get a pathway to citizenship or even residency. People that are married to U.S. citizens that are trapped, right? You think, wait, what do you mean? She's married to a U.S. citizen. Why can't she get her documents? And the world was very different in the 70s and in the 60s and in the 80s. And so when I worked in the Hill, I realized that not a lot of change is going to come because our economy depends so heavily on these systems of shadow work, of immigrants not being paid properly, right? Farm workers, you've got factory workers, you've got domestic workers. And so that is what led me, after doing a lot of immigration work, public defender work, I've worn every hat under the sun. After all of that, I decided I wanted to build a nonprofit so that I could teach people their rights, start from the beginning, start at the border, figure out somatic ways in which to teach immigrants what their rights are as humans, right? Inalienable rights, the right to breathe, the right to love who you love, the right to have food on the table in a dignified way. And so I built Touching Land, which is a nonprofit that I run now, where we teach immigrant rights through somatic practices like ceramics, like cooking, like running. And we build a lot of tools like fortune tellers of rights with symbols that we teach children in the border so that they understand their rights as they cross. So for me, it's about making sure people don't get exploited along the way and understand that they have a right to seek asylum, they have a right to be paid proper wages, they have a right to just advocate for themselves. And so I'm excited to have someone like you that understands cohesively and holistically how these issues come together. Because this is the future, right? It is about pushing legislation that shows us the world that we dream of building and that we deserve.
Yeah. So when you said you were 19 when you came to the US?
I did, yes.
And I'd love for you both to speak to this. And what brought you to the US? Like, why did you decide for school?
No. So it was more, I was in law school and an art school in Bogota, and I was being threatened with my life. So I had to leave. I was very outspoken, and yeah, nothing has changed, but in that aspect. But we had to leave. And so I had to migrate to the US, and, I did undergrad and then I did law school in Oklahoma. And so luckily I knew English and was raised with a lot of privileges, which enabled me to successfully complete, college and law school, and continue to sort of, I think, push boundaries and others in order to become who I am now.
And did you come by yourself, or who did you come with?
So I came with my brothers first.
Okay.
We came through school. So because we had access to lawyers, we were able to come here, get advising before coming here. And that is huge, right? Which is why when I was in the border, my first summer of law school, I think there's a lot of nationalism and pride in nationalism in South America. and a lot of division. And so, certain countries are seen as less than, and like Colombia is better. It's such a terrible narrative, but you're sort of like bought into the narrative. And so once I met people on the border, I was like, wow, they're no different than me, except that I had access to money, I had access to education. And so that sort of became my guiding force, right? Like just making sure that people have as best a possibility as I can build, because I was lucky enough to have better privilege. So to me, it's like, it's an honor and it's a duty to make sure that I can pull up as many people as I can.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Vanessa, what brought you to the US? I know you were a bit younger. I would love to hear about your journey.
Yeah, definitely. I immigrated to the US when I was around 6 years old. And so for me, it's a very fuzzy, like, I didn't know what was happening because I was a very young child, and I'm an only child. So it was just me and my mom and my dad. But similarly, like, I immigrated first, and then my parents came and joined me. We stayed with some family, and essentially, what I came to understand later on in life is that my parents were seeking asylum when we first immigrated. So they entered the US through our tourist visas, and then my father began filling out all the paperwork for seeking asylum. All of that got rejected by the government for reasons unknown to me, but at that point we were here and we were going to stay. I think my parents' fear of returning to Colombia, similarly for safety reasons, and my father was also threatened quite a bit in Colombia, and so their fear of returning to Colombia was greater than their fear of staying here undocumented, and so that's what we did. And I, yeah, just had to grapple with all of this as I was like growing up and developing as a human, and like not fully understanding. And we ended up living in Michigan for most of my upbringing, and just, yeah, being raised around like families who had totally different backgrounds. And I think what was difficult for me is that I didn't really understand what was happening, understand what it meant to be undocumented. And I was living in a very hostile territory where like people weren't necessarily like very educated on what it meant to be an immigrant, and weren't super open to immigrants in general. And so I just had to hide lots of parts of me, including the fact that I was undocumented. I couldn't really communicate that to anyone for all of my upbringing, which is why now I speak about it so vocally. I think it's important to, I think speak for my own inner child and also all of the kids who grew up like me. Like Carolina mentioned, the 12 million undocumented immigrants. There's just a lot of us. And I'm no longer undocumented, but still carry that identity with me.
What was your pathway then? Well, thank you for sharing that and for speaking to that. And I can only imagine just the challenge and the weird feeling of existing as an undocumented immigrant, because like to be in that sort of purgatory, or worse than purgatory, I guess, it's just to be in between spaces, I guess, and in between like these definitions and things. I can imagine that would be really challenging. And so what is your current legal status, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, well, I adjusted my my status and am now a permanent resident, but that is still pending. It's been, again, a lifelong process. I'm 27 now and still don't have like a permanent solution or citizenship in the US. It's something that I'm very well on my way, and also have, I'm lucky to have a status, lucky to be adjusting into permanent residency, but even so, I still don't have like a permanent solution. And that feels not only frustrating, but pretty terrifying, because everything that I'm building for myself, my career, my advocacy, all of it could just go away. And it's a very real fear that a lot of people carry, especially those of us who immigrated at a young age, because the alternative of like returning to our home country is a country that we don't really know, And I think like I have family in Colombia, but if I had to move to Colombia now, I wouldn't really know what to do, because all of my eggs are in this basket that is the US, and this is the place that I love and care for and want to just stay here forever basically. But that is still just not a certainty.
Yeah. And Carolina, what about you? Were you able to what's your current Can you explain to me actually like the different, like how it works for someone that comes? Because I don't think that as like a natural born United States citizen, I don't know that I fully understand the pathway to citizenship or to coming into this country. And I know it's kind of a hot mess right now. And so I would really love to, yeah, maybe you can run me down
Yeah.
on that.
Absolutely. And I think it's, people tend to be like, oh, just wait in line and come the legal way. And, it's so limiting. And so you have either family-based or business-based. Those are the two sort of buckets in which you can come in, and asylum. And asylum is an international law that we recognize and adjusted to internationally. So it's a law that we have to respect. But it's very limited. So it's because of your sexual orientation or political association, or it's because of your religion. There's certain categories, indigenous, like that you have to fit specifically, 5 categories. And so if you don't fit in those, then, you can't really migrate, but there's no clarity on that. And I'll get a little bit more into asylum, but essentially the big thing is you can either come through business immigration or through family. And through family, meaning only your immediate relatives can come. So children, parents, and siblings. And for siblings, there's a wait because every year in October 1st is our immigration calendar year. And the Senate is the one that decides how many visas are allotted per sort of section. As I stated earlier in our chat, laws have not changed. The Immigration and Naturalization Act has not been changed since the 60s. And we had periodic amnesties where people would be, say, legalized here, but nothing. The last one that was proposed was in 2011 and 2001, and it didn't pass after 9/11. And so it's really hard for you to be able to adjust into the country, especially, for instance, for people that cross the border as farm workers. In the 70s, the border was just really fluid. In the 80s, we changed our laws and essentially captured people, where we said, there's no more coming back and forth. So investing, people don't want to live here, right? I mean, not that people don't want to live here, but let's start with the fact that, I didn't want to leave my country. I was forced to leave my country. I was forced to adjust to another language, adjust to another country. If I had a choice, I would want to go back to my people, right? And so after World War II, all of our men were fighting wars and we needed help for our crops and our economy. And that's when we started pulling people from Central America, and we realized we had to pay them less in order to get the same results. And so that created an opportunity for profit. And so that was sort of like what started this migratory seasonal migration. But all of that came to a halt in the 80s when we created the 5-year and the 10-year bar, which is the big fear of these 12 million undocumented people, which is if I leave, the moment I leave, I am given like this castigo. ¿Cómo se dice castigo?
Punishment.
Punishment. Sorry, sometimes like my brain. We give them this punishment if your inability to come back into the country for 10 years, or sometimes a permanent bar. So imagine if someone brought you as a child, you did not adjust under DACA because you aged out, because it's a very limiting window. Everything is very limited. And imagine you're married to a US citizen and have children. You've been here longer than 1 year, calendar year, which is what creates this 10-year bar or 3-year bar, very limited times. And so your only option of adjustment is leaving the country, and everything lies on a waiver and a pardon from the consulate in the US in your country, which is completely like arbitrary. There's no like sort of rigorous laws that followed. It's just whatever this person thinks. And so with that fear of being unable to come back to the US where you built your life, you're unable to adjust. And so it creates this sense of captivity where you're just like unable, you're in limbo. We have all these people that are in limbo that are married to US citizens or that didn't qualify for DACA, that are in this limbo where they want to adjust, but there's no way for them to adjust because our laws have not created space for that adjustment. And then as far as business immigration, there's not enough business immigration. When I applied for my immigration for my visa, was an H-1 visa, and it was the only way that it would lead to residency because you have certain visas that are only for you to work here, and other visas that are, dual intent is what we call them. Back then, I was able to get the visa. Now it's a lottery. So we're not getting the brightest or people, we're rejecting a lot of incredible minds out there that could really help us. And not to mention that we are breaking and separating families every time that, for people in Utah, right? Just for people everywhere where they really are working, they have a job, they have no criminal record, they've been paying taxes, right? Immigrants, undocumented immigrants paid taxes in the millions and the billions. I think it was 2.3 billion last year that were paid through an ID number, an ITIN, and people think that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes, and that's a fallacy.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of lack of understanding of our immigration system and how these laws have not changed. And to me, what was really sad when I worked in the Hill was realizing why would anyone want to change these policies when there's so much money to be made? When people are not being paid justly, people will not call the cops when they are being abused. And so it creates the situation where, the avocado that we are eating is not worth $2.5. It's really worth $5.50 if you pay the person that is harvesting it fairly. So it's complicated, but it's simple.
It is. Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot of challenges. Have you had to work, Vanessa, have you had to work a lot with lawyers on your status, or it sounds like also just a big headache of paperwork?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my earliest memories of this, obviously, like my parents had their own like lawyers and whole process with paperwork, but when I had DACA, which is the deferred action for childhood arrivals, I first received DACA when I was 16 or 17. And I remember it had just come out. And again, like there's just not a lot of political literacy to start with in immigrant communities. Like my parents were never able to vote, for example, and it's not something that they could pass down to me. Like Carolina was talking about, like knowing our rights. I think there's so much fear of the unknown when you're undocumented that you really don't know your rights at all. When DACA first came out, I remember there was a lot of pause because people were saying, well, this is just a way to get undocumented people on some sort of record so that they're easier to deport. So that was a fear that I had when I was first applying for DACA. I did a lot of it myself. I filled out a lot of paperwork. I remember like the first time I had to do taxes, I was like, oh, this is exactly like my immigration forms. Like I've been doing this since I was like 17. But yeah, I think it just costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time, and you have to have a lot of literacy to be able to actually jump through the hoops to fill out paperwork, apply for visas. Even with DACA, like you have to renew all of these things every 2 years, and all of it, I don't know what the prices are now. It was like $895 back in my day. But even that is like a substantial amount of money that a lot of immigrant communities don't just have like to give away. And so, yeah, I think a lot about the privileges that come with even being able to apply, being able to speak English to a level where you can read these forms and fill them out correctly. It's super tricky.
It's super tricky. And I was going to say, not that many regular average Americans have political literacy. And so when you add on that, the extra layers of language and culture and all of these other things, like I feel like it's a hot mess for me to do my taxes.
Yeah.
It's so confusing. And I pay accountants and bookkeepers and all these people because I honestly have no idea how to do them. It's so confusing as an S corp, and I want to make sure I do it right. And for me, the penalty might be just like paying extra money because I did them incorrectly, or a late penalty. But it must be really stressful when you live under the constant fear of deportation. And like, do you know people that have been deported? Like, can you speak a little bit more to that? And I also just wanted to add, like, that DACA, that's the Dreamers, right? Like the Dreamers Act, too. They're used interchangeably. And so that prevents you from being deported, and it gives you the right to work in the country, or the work permit.
Yeah, so it's a very temporary solution. Like it currently doesn't offer any pathways to citizenship, which is incredibly frustrating. But essentially DACA provides and I'm sure Carolina can lawyer this up for me, but it provides like a temporary solution to being undocumented, and you have to keep renewing it every 2 years. And it's sort of under this, under this premise that like you have to be a model citizen, which means like you can't get into any trouble. You have to like keep working. But it does provide you with an opportunity to have a driver's license and a social security number, which allows you, and a work permit, which allows you to work. You have to keep renewing it. And you can't vote. There's no like pathway. And what's actually super sad too is that DACA is only for childhood arrivals, and it doesn't include your parents. So I know that was something that was really hard for me, like my parents sort of watching me outgrow them in a sense of like, I achieved all of these things. Like I could work legally in the US, which is something they never had. And so there's a lot of gaps in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that people don't realize is, which is so much of why I do the work I do, is the like anxiety and the constant sense of your nervous system being triggered constantly when you hear a siren, when you walk into a place and someone says something abusive or disrespectful to you, and your inability to like say something back, when someone is cheating you in a transaction, your inability to speak up, right? And it just follows you everywhere. And so, DACA was just a Band-Aid from the Obama years where, no comprehensive immigration reform was achieved. It wasn't bipartisan, and there's so much immigration issues are used as such a scapegoat instead of sort of being able to celebrate the amazing diversity that we have. I look at the Olympics and I'm like, wow, we are celebrating all of these incredibly diverse background people from all over in the American team. Yet, we turn around and we sort of point the finger at our neighbor because they're not, they don't look like us or they don't speak like us. And so it's sort of, it's been lovely to see the Olympics and that celebration of what America, our ideals of what America is, right? And so, I think that DACA is temporary. DAPA, unfortunately, which was the Deferred Action for Parents, it was like the DACA for Parents did not pass. And again, I think it's we really need a more comprehensive and more holistic way of seeing how of reforming immigration and being able to honor our neighbors, the people we went to school with, because they're everywhere, and they are the ones that take care of our children and take care of our restaurants, our homes, our gardens. And so I feel so honored to be able to work with them and sort of serve them and remind them of their power so that they can walk in the world understanding that they deserve every little bit of respect, dignity, and love.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your journeys, because I think that having the human perspective, and even if people don't know you, I hope that through this podcast that they can feel like they are a little closer to this issue, because I think that I hear so much of this rhetoric where people are just pointing fingers and using really dehumanizing language, like calling undocumented immigrants illegals. Like that bothers me so deeply to my core. And it's like the rhetoric here in Utah, where I live, is so strong as well. And I'm like, we are a state that came here from people who were trying to flee to flee religious persecution. And when Utahns came here and first settled, it was Mexico. So I'm like, you would think that we would have more tolerance. I know that we do in our hearts. Like, we just need to peel away some of the layers and get back to that. I really do believe that Utahns, in our heart, we are like an open and inclusive, understanding group of people. And so I really appreciate you sharing. I was curious if there have been times like where you failed to like get medical care or anything like that because you were afraid of your status or being discovered as undocumented. Because that's something where my mind goes as well when I think about the disparate health outcomes for people of color, and especially like relating to maternal mortality or the number of women who die giving childbirth, because I know that that's much greater for women of color.
Yeah, I can speak to my experience just growing up undocumented. And this is you know, when we speak of privilege, it's not like it could have been worse, but I didn't have health insurance growing up like all of my life. And that barred me from having access to the outdoors and sports in general. So, like, you know, like 27-year-old Vanessa, like little Vanessa would be shocked to meet her now because I am so different. But I was essentially just like a total bookworm and I stayed inside all the time. And I really had this idea that like outdoor movement and sports just was something that I would never be able to achieve. I remember specifically when I was growing up, I wanted to join the tennis team because all of my friends were doing tennis, and immediately, like, you needed a physical to be able to join the tennis team, which is something that is so simple, but I couldn't get a physical. And I remember I had to go to this like free clinic and wait like 2 months for them to have availability to see me. And all the while I was showing up to tennis practice and just sitting on the sidelines, like watching all of my friends play. And after that, I never joined again, right? Because it was humiliating. And it was this situation where like I didn't belong and I didn't have access to these things. And my mom was always just like she's like a good Latina mom who's just like always worried all the time. But it was super real in terms of like if I broke my elbow, like an ER visit was going to cost us so much money because we had no type of health insurance at all. And that really stuck with me as a child, you know. And I think like having access to like even like team sports, like being able to join your high school tennis team, whatever it is something that like every child deserves to have. And yeah, just like really shaped who I was. And it took me a long time to actually break out of this like, oh, I do belong in the outdoors and I do belong in sports, because when I was growing up, every direction was telling me like you don't belong in this space.
Well, it's so cool to see how you've been able to take risks, you know, and to turn that around and to find like to do so many amazing things in the outdoors. So Vanessa has done these epic ultra runs through the Tetons and skied some massive big lines. And I can't imagine just the mindset shift to growing up like that to now doing what you do now. So it's super cool that you've been able to reclaim that for yourself and to find the sense of belonging and to be able to take risks. Because I think, like, for me, being able to take risks in the mountains gives me such a sense of personal power, confidence, accomplishment. Like, it helps me reclaim all the narratives that were, you know, not serving me when I was a child. And it's so cool to see what you've been able to do with that for yourself. And Carolina, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, during the pandemic, you know, I lost students who didn't want to go to the hospital because they were worried that they would be deported.
Mm,
And so we, you know, I make sure that people understand that they shouldn't die on the street,
yeah.
that they can seek help. So a lot of like, I'll show you like a quick tool. This is one of the fortune tellers we share with our students in the border. We teach the children mostly because children will absorb a lot of the information. A lot of the moms are too stressed. And one of the things we tell them is like their access to healthcare. We use symbols for, you know, language can be such a barrier, and a lot of the work we do is really simplifying language so that there's more accessibility. And so one of the things that we try to teach them is the fact that they have a right to access to medical. And someone, you know, just this idea of how COVID hit in such disparate ways where, you know, my friends and colleagues were enjoying time at home and working from home, where most of my students were dying at home alone with no food for their children because, you know, they make weekly salaries and some people were not paying them. So it's this sort of invisible group of people that sustain our economy and sustain us, right? As working mothers, who's taking care of our children?
Yeah.
And so all of these issues everything is so intersectional, right? That we can't talk about reproductive rights without talking about immigration and how it affects, you know, women of color, or how it affects, you know, most of my students have been sick or have some sort of tumor or some sort of something that they've had for a long time because they've been unable to access medical, not to mention the mental health, right? And so we teach a lot of mindfulness, and movement is so healing, as we're saying, and that's so much of why for me, I run because I can, but it also reminds me of my power and my freedom. And so being able to remind people that movement, that we belong in the woods, that we have a right to joy in the woods is so beautiful. And I love that, Vane, you've been able to do so much. And, immigrants are huge risk takers because we've lost everything already. So we actually, if you just take the Latinx community, our economy would actually be the 5th largest in the world, the American Latino community economy. So it's an underlooked, underserved, sort of like group of people that I think we should be courted more. So I appreciate you calling us for this podcast.
No, I'm so grateful for you to share your story. And I just had like 2-3 more questions, because one of the other things that you spoke a little bit about, the intersection with reproductive freedom and with healthcare, and that's one of the things that I think about all the time when I talk about policy, is like government and our society just wants to like put everything into their little box. But I'm like, these issues are so much more intersectionally related than we realize. And I was also wondering if you both could speak to the intersection with climate and the reason that so many people want to come to the United States, because I think as we get hotter and hotter and we start to see more and more the effects of the climate crisis, that we're going to see a lot more climate refugees and climate migrants. And I know that's something you both have spoken a lot about.
Yeah. Okay. I'll start. I think I really approach this from my background in sociology and having a larger understanding of how our global economies work. And I think it just kind of like blew my mind when I learned about the dynamics between the global north and the global south. The global north are the countries that hold most of the resources, have the larger GDPs, have a lot of exportations and input and output, but get most of their resources from countries in the global south, including Colombia, countries that have just like a lower political standing, a lot of countries that have been colonized instead of being the colonists themselves, and have fallen prey to imperialism. So Colombia is a country that I think about a lot because the US intervention in Colombia has gotten us to where we are today, to the point where on a global standpoint, Colombia is indebted to these nations, including the UK, including the US, Canada, to the point where all of the resources that Colombia holds, Colombia is one of the most diverse countries in the world and just holds so much richness, but all of that richness is being taken from Colombia and being put into places in the global north so that we can enjoy things like gold or lithium batteries or whatever it may be at little or no cost to us, because our environments, our physical proximity to outdoor spaces are not being tainted like they are in Colombia. And so it's essentially this give and take where the US and other countries in the global north are creating refugees. They're creating situations in which people have to flee their countries. Like Carolina was talking about earlier, nobody wants to leave their home. Nobody wants to leave their families. We are forced to. And a lot of those greater forces, including imperialism, the global north, do have to do with the US, right? And so it's directly related, to the point where the United States is creating a need for people to leave their countries, but also shutting their borders. And so it's this, when you put it together, you understand that the US does have a moral responsibility, not only to its citizens, but citizens of the world and to nature in general, for how we're treating the earth. And so, yeah, it's all completely interconnected and we are all affected by it. And the problem is that people who live in the US, people who are natural born citizens, never got the chance to understand these interconnections. So that's something that I work to bring to light, because I think it's important to educate people on like, hey, this is happening and you're actually kind of responsible for it in a lot of ways that you don't know. So that's kind of my introduction, and it's a lot.
Yeah, it's heavy. I mean, I remember in university, I had to read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and that really goes into some of the stories about how the U.S. Intentionally manipulates these kind of countries to make them forever indebted. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a just touches on one tiny portion of this, but I really appreciate you speaking into this because it seems to me that to have a comprehensive solution to immigration or to create policies that are really robust, we need to also be addressing the reasons why so many people are being forced to leave their countries to begin with. So thank you for speaking to that. And Carolina, go ahead. I want to hear your take.
I've been going to the border for the last 20 years, specifically the Texas border, Texas Reynosa specific. And, the transition of migration from countries has been incredible in the sense that 5 or 6 years ago, it would mostly be Central or South America, and it would oscillate. So I would go and see people from El Salvador, or if like Venezuela was destabilized, people from Venezuela or Colombia. You could sort of track what was happening. I started working with a nonprofit called Territorial Empathy that has done a lot of GIS mapping around climate disasters and migration. And it's pretty incredible to see the correlation between, mudslides in certain regions in the countries and then the migration that follows the next year because the crops and whatever farming whatever it is that is the economic stability, like the stability for that region is no longer available because of mudslides, earthquakes, you name it, whatever natural disaster, and seeing how people from that area migrate. And you find them in the border, a lot of indigenous communities. And so it went from being that just sort of like region of South and Central America to actually people from Africa. So we have a ton of West African men migrating now in the last like year and a half, specifically from Mauritania and Senegal. And when I talk to these men with whom I run with, they tell me that they used to be fishermen, and there's no more fish to fish in the region, in their specific village. And so they migrate, and it takes them 3 to 4 months to come here. And it's a journey that I cannot describe. Like I keep going to the border because it humbles me and it reminds me why I'm doing my work when it's incredibly frustrating and challenging. And, it's such a hard emotional job, but it keeps me grounded and it shows me sort of like where the conflicts are in the world, where these countries are becoming hotter. Like Vanessa's saying, we're taking away their economic livelihoods, we're abusing them, and we're destabilizing their countries and their policies. And so they're having to migrate, and then they're stuck in the border, unable to cross. And the color of your skin depends on how quickly you cross that border, unfortunately. And so we're producing this really awful situation. I can tell you, before Trump took office, we were speaking about with some people in Mexico, some progressives in Mexico, and some people in Brooklyn. We were actually trying to build stability in the border towns. We were going to have some money and like just poured into the border so that communities could sort of like be reborn. And that failed because of the lack of communication and the lack of vision of what we need to do. And it can't just be like borders and stabilizing ourselves. Like our duty now is to make sure that we can invest and make sure that those other countries are stable so that whoever wants to go back can go back to something if they want to go back. And so it's really scary to see how climate is forcing a lot of migration. We are not talking about it. We are not connecting the dots. And I think it's imperative that we start doing something and we become creative with the way in which we support other nations, shift our economy, become more responsible, even as individuals, to support companies that have the integrities and values that mirror our values. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do there.
There's a lot of work. What do you wish people knew about immigrants?
Okay, this is something that I've been trying to communicate for years. And it's essentially, I think like we do need to humanize these issues. And I think my way of humanizing things is through outdoor access and recreation, particularly like movement in the outdoors, right? And I think when I think of all three of us, like we love to run, we love to be outside, we feel free. Like we when we're outside and we're flowing down a trail, we feel this innate feeling of belonging and freedom. And it's something that we also wish that everybody else felt. And so for me, my movement outdoors is not separate from a family migrating across the border. And that's what I'm trying to really hone in on is like we all deserve this freedom of movement, and it goes beyond being able to run or being able to ski. It extends to being able to find shelter and food for our families and create a legacy of safety and belonging and having people move out of these like trauma responses that last for generations and really be able to thrive and create and connect with the land. And that at the end of the day is what I advocate for, is we all deserve to be able to move freely through the land, whether we're skiing, whether we're running, or whether we're immigrating. All of it is the same to me, and I think we all deserve that access.
Well, I just got goosebumps. That was so beautifully said. Thank you. And Carolina,
Yeah.
what would you say? What do you wish people knew about immigrants, or what would you like them to know?
I mean, I wish people, it really, so much of my work is about distilling that fear that we have of the unknown, right? And it really is the fear of the narratives that we've been told of the other, immigrant or Afghani or whatever it is, right? You name it, whatever, Russia, nuclear, or 9/11, whatever it is, the trauma that we're dealing with, whatever was fed to us. And when we're talking about humanizing, what I realized in Oklahoma, when I was in law school there was with beautiful humans, beautiful people, was it really takes very little for people to recognize how much more we have in common that we don't. And so much of the work we do is putting different people into a room and sort of like getting rid of the walls and what separates us and that fear, and showing them that we actually have a lot more in common. And so something as simple as, oh, she likes Dunkin' Donuts. I always use that example because it's literally what happened in one of our workshops, where it's like you meet Juan, and now Juan is a person with a child the same way as you, and they laugh at the same thing as you, and they have a funky little walk. And immediately when you hear immigration, you're able to connect Juan and you're able to humanize it. And your brain is able to say, actually, that's wrong, because that's not what I learned from Juan. He's actually a really nice guy. And so for me, it's I wish people knew the power that they have in shifting narratives, where if they give someone an opportunity and they go beyond the like pleasantries and actually give a little more, get more involved with local grassroots organizations, something you're like really passionate about, that can shift so much in a community. And when we realize that, we are indispensable, we're so intricately connected, we realize that it's our duty to make sure that we speak up for our immigrants. And so I just wish people realized just how the commonalities, the beauty, the joy, and your power as an individual within your community.
Okay, real quick, 1 to 2 policy recommendations that would make your life better, easier, that a senator could do.
Oh man. So many. I mean, I just
or
wish
you could give me a laundry list if you want. I'll take it. I'll take it and I'll push for it.
I mean, I have so many. I mean, just like we just need a full reform, immigration reform. I think we owe it to people that are inside the US to find a legal pathway, especially people that have been here for 30, 20, 10, 5 years, especially the young ones or the old ones, people that have businesses. So like creating pathways for people that have been here forever and that are part of our economy. I would also create a welcoming center where people can be, not sifted and treated inhumanely through asylum, but actually welcomed. Immigrants are one of the hardest people. We work so hard, we're faithful because we're given a second chance. And so I think anybody that has gone through that can relate to it. I would create childcare, more childcare, and also transparency in salaries. I would make hospitals, pharmaceuticals pay their price and make sure that hospitals are more accessible and free. I mean, yeah, I have a lot of lists, but I think that those would be the three that are really important to me.
Especially, I love all those ideas, but especially the idea of a welcome center. That would be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
That would be really cool. If
more resources down there.
If we can't get the federal government to do one, we should look at doing a private part, like a nonprofit project to do that and fundraise, because that would be incredible. That would be really, really amazing.
And it speaks more to our American, like we're so proud, or Americans are so proud of being welcoming and giving. And I just don't know why we don't shift that narrative.
Yeah. Vanessa, what about from your standpoint and your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think big picture, same, like providing permanent pathways to citizenship for all immigrants. I think particularly with DACA, like providing some sort of solution for DACA kids who are now in their 30s and just kind of awaiting this thing that may never come. I think a big one is like when I was DACA and I was applying to go to college, I couldn't get any in-state tuition. And so maybe working with individual states to provide more privileges and benefits for DACA kids who live in their own states. And another big one for me is fighting against voter suppression for immigrant communities, for incarcerated communities, for disabled communities. I think that's something that everyone would benefit for. And I know, Caroline, you've been doing some work around gerrymandering and other stuff like that. But I think just helping to, one, illuminate the ways in which voters of color are suppressed, and two, providing pathways or more education or more resources so that folks can exercise their right to vote.
Yeah, that makes it. I mean, if someone's paying taxes, I think that they should be able to vote. I don't think that should be controversial at all. And when you think about the fact that 1 in 5 small businesses are started by immigrants, like, it's a huge asset to our communities. Those folks, you all should certainly have a stake in the outcome of elections. So those are awesome. Thank you both so much. Is there anything else you want to add? How can we follow and support your work?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram at Vanessa_Chav, CHAV. I post most of my writing and advocacy on there.
Yeah. Carolina?
You can follow me on Insta as well, Carustol, CARUSTOL. I do a lot of running rights, a lot of our programming, and also follow touchingland.org, which is where most of the Know Your Rights and somatic practices live.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time and to share about your experiences and to share your wealth of information. I cannot thank you enough. And I hope that we can get out on the trail sometime soon and share a run. Do you have any plans to be in Utah?
I was just in Utah and I loved it this summer.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So we should go back.
You should come back. Yeah, anytime you want to come visit. But probably after, well, let's keep in touch for sure. Would love to share some miles on the trail together. Don't know if I can keep up, but I'll try. And yeah, Vanessa, I hope to see you soon. I miss you.
Yeah, I miss you too. I'll make it to Utah at some point soon.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much. Keep in touch. Really appreciate it. And we'll keep this going. We'll keep this fight going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Caroline.
Awesome. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.